For fellow art rebels who want to imagine new worlds, Revolution Art Society is a monthly newsletter and podcast that dives deep into the ideas, experiences, and people inhabiting the cracks in the establishment. Join artist and mother Maya Mackrandilal as she explores enticing new ways of looking at the world and engages in conversations with creators of all kinds. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. As always, thank you for the gift of your time and attention. In this episode, I'm sharing a personal and artistic reflection. In my vlog earlier this month, I discussed a practice I've been implementing this year called a personal timeline, where the goal is to zoom out to see the larger patterns in my life, both the positive patterns and the patterns that may be keeping me in a bit of a rut. If you're interested in trying this out for yourself, head on over to the Revolution Art Society YouTube channel and check it out. A period in my life and in my art practice that has emerged as deeply significant for me in the process of creating my personal timeline was my Saturn return. And in astrology, this is the time in a person's life where the planet Saturn returns to the sign it was in when you were born, which for me started in October of 2012 when Saturn entered Scorpio and ended in September of 2015. This time was a wild ride, and I wanted to share the story of it, a condensed story of it with you, and how the process of reflecting on this is informing how I move forward as an artist and a mother. At the start of 2013, I left my first post-grad school admin job to teach as a sabbatical replacement for my mentor, Bill Bennett, in the sculpture department at the University of Virginia. And that was an experience that was deeply inspiring, but also challenging. Teaching at UVA meant returning to my undergraduate institution, interacting with my former professors as a peer, and really getting a completely different view of my experience there, which was nice. It was also isolating and lonely since I was away from my partner. I was living in a really toxic, weird roommate situation, and I wasn't able to find a sense of community in the short time I was there. I didn't know it at the time, but my tarot card of the year for 2013 was the Hermit. So now it makes a lot of sense. In the vlog, I talk about a piece I made while I was at UVA that I'm really proud of. It's a 7.5-hour durational performance in front of the Phoolan Museum of Art titled Seated Woman. So again, check out the vlog for a little bit more about that piece. When I returned to Chicago that summer, so I was only at UVA for a semester, I struggled to find work, but I tried to stay positive. My partner Sean and I got married in a sweet ceremony after 8.5 years of being together, not being married, in the park near our apartment with family and friends. In the fall, I would apply for jobs in the morning and spend the afternoons writing a sci-fi novella titled Spectre. But as time went on and no job materialized, I became severely depressed. I had struggled with mental health most of my life. I had pretty extreme anxiety that I remember starting as early as preschool. And then depression that really kicked into high gear when I was a teenager and then kind of followed me. Now I can look back and have a lot of compassion for myself and recognize how strong I was for keeping everything together in quite unstable life circumstances. But you can only bare knuckle mental health issues for so long before everything kind of collapses. My Saturn return was when the voice in my head, the one saying that nothing about my life was that hard and I was making a big deal out of nothing. I now realize that was really what my mother had said to me when I asked to see a therapist in high school. So that voice was overpowered by the stark reality that my life was not functioning, that I could not just be immobilized by depression indefinitely, that something needed to change. Luckily, at the start of 2014, I found a good therapist, something I later learned can be very challenging. So very thankful that that first attempt was successful in that time. And I began the long journey of healing that I'm still on today. As I slowly started to take care of myself mentally, opportunities started to open up for me in the various creative communities in Chicago. I worked as an assistant to my friend Pedro Velez as he prepared for his work to be included in the 2014 Whitney Biennial, including helping him with his installation at Monique Meloche Gallery. And I would end up working part-time there a few months later. For Teatro Luna's production of Generation Sext, I created a mobile set that could be broken down into duffel bags, travel in airplanes in the luggage compartment, then be set up somewhere and broken down again and move on, as well as still and video projections to go along with the performance, including stop motion animation. That was also when I met my good friend Enid, who was the first guest on this podcast in episode 2, and she would later kind of come together with me and some other women of color to form Femelanin during that time as well. After attending the Whitney Biennial opening with Pedro, my friend Unsung and I wrote a review of the show titled The Whitney Biennial for Angry Women, which got a lot of attention in the art world at the time, in particular calling out this really problematic piece by Joe Scanlon, where I don't want to get into it, but he basically kind of had this fake Black woman that he created that created artwork. And then he would hire actresses to play her and go do visits at various arts institutions. And it was, very telling of the show that she, quote unquote, Joe Scanlon got this really prominent placement while actual Black women were really sidelined in the show. So yeah, there was a pretty big dust up about all of that. And our article was definitely part of that conversation. This was also when I started my Thug Life card series, an attempt to reclaim the word thug from the right wing, which at the time was using the term to attack Michael Brown to justify his murder by a police officer. The word thug comes from the Hindi word thugee, meaning bandit, and its entry into English came through British colonialism as bands of thuggees would attack British trade routes. Thuggees were often seen as Robin Hood type figures in the community, and one of the most prominent thuggees was Phoolan Devi, known as the Bandit Queen. Phoolan is a recurring figure in my work. Her life story is one of unspeakable trauma and superhuman resistance. She was born into a system of extreme injustice, violence, and oppression, and became a bandit as a means of escaping that system. And though her life was full of struggle and tragedy, she was able to claim power in extraordinary ways. I was interested in redefining a thug as a woman of color who has in some way resisted systems of oppression, who has perhaps gotten her hands dirty in the complex ways that living as a revolutionary may require. At the time, I had not yet read The Undercommons by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. But I think I was trying to get at that idea of fugitivity that they explore in that book. The idea that sometimes to resist is to be a criminal. Looking back now, 2014 and 2015 were the years in my life so far when I was the most inside the art world, exhibiting my art at galleries, connecting with artists and curators in Chicago and beyond, attending openings and after parties, was at Vernissage at Expo Chicago, working at a well-established art gallery. And while there was a lot of generative energy around these experiences, I also felt deeply uncomfortable in that space. I had troubling interactions, encountered people that were really quite toxic, and I got to experience firsthand how the myth of capital A art that our institutions feed us, from academia and art criticism to museums and funders, is an illusion. Art, you could say, has become, or maybe in the West, it always was, high-end retail. And any higher calling on the part of the artist can never truly escape the desires and values of the consumer. It was during this time that while I was a Hatch resident at the Chicago Artists Coalition, I created my series, How to Be a Monster, starting with the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer in 2013, through Michael Brown's murder in 2014, and the many killings beyond. The voices of Black Lives Matter protesters were entering the cultural discourse. The post-race myth that was born when Obama was elected in 2008 was finally crumbling as the real lived experiences of marginalized people became testament to the continued power of racism in America. As the myth of progress cracked open, white people, and in my mind, white men in particular, needed to confront what was beneath before it swallowed us all. I had been thinking about a phrase from Darren Wilson's grand jury testimony when he described Michael Brown. He said that Brown looked like a demon, and it reminded me of a book titled Much Maligned Monsters. In it, the author analyzes the early writing of European travelers to places like India, comparing their descriptions of art objects with the actual objects themselves. He found that the descriptions often did not reflect the art at all, so they might describe horns when there were no horns, or hooves on the figure when there are no hooves, which are motifs that depict the devil in Western traditions. So essentially, he found that the descriptions often did not reflect the physical art at all, but rather the expectations of the person writing the account, that Europeans expected to see demons, so that is what they saw. I thought about how all people of color, all across the world, must live within the imaginations of white men. That for many, this imaginative space not only justifies their oppression, but in the case of Michael Brown and countless others, their death. This space of the white male imagination, what I've come to think of now after Jung as the white male collective unconscious, seemed simultaneously enticing and threatening. In many ways, I felt that I, and many people of color who navigate white spaces, have a PhD in its study. We understand that how we move, how we talk, how we take up space activates this white male collective unconscious, so that we are always inhabiting a projection, never truly seen, never truly present, never truly whole in their gaze. I was speaking with the artist curator who was our mentor for the Hatch residency, who also happened to be a white man, about these ideas and how in navigating this gaze, I was always having to push back against the perception of me being angry. And he asked, what if you made art from that place? What if you made the angry art? What if you weren't afraid of being seen as angry or making white men uncomfortable? What if you purposely tried to make them uncomfortable? What kind of art would you make? And that was where the idea for the goddesses started to take form. Throughout time, the goddesses in India have survived within patriarchy, reflecting the society they inhabit, but also fundamentally undercutting it with the suggestiveness of femme power. Symbols of fertility and sexuality that exist within sexually repressive regimes, unstoppable warriors within cultures of wanton violence against women, representing the very source of knowledge and art while girls are denied access to education. Their existence is a challenge and an invitation. Just as the depictions of the goddesses changed and evolved over time in India and beyond, I wanted to create depictions that emerged from US culture, images that both reflected and challenged the heart of empire. So my version of Durga was incarnated as Phoolan Devi, riding astride a white man with a ball gag in his mouth while she was holding a rifle. Lakshmi, goddess of wealth and abundance, had a Kim Kardashian vibe, making it rain like a rap star, with one Confederate Speedo wearing white man in light bondage gear underfoot, and another white man wearing a pig mask, business tie, and an American flag Speedo on a leash, kneeling beside her. Saraswati, goddess of knowledge and art, appeared as a version of the pro-am porn star Mia Khalifa, but reversing the sex act that she became globally famous for while reading Black Marxism. Kali, goddess of death, destruction, renewal, and the embodiment of time itself, infiltrated Michelangelo's Pieta with a jewel-red dildo tongue, cradling the dying figure of white supremacy in her arms. Looking back on these creations with this zoomed-out context, I see that I was connecting with very distinctly Scorpio energy, the energy of the taboo, the things we don't want to look at, both personally and culturally. So, of course, the work struck a chord, but not always in the ways you might expect. People of color, and women of color in particular, were incredibly positive about the work. I remember a woman wanting to hug me at the opening, which seemed like a resounding success. And while there was the expected discomfort of white men in our Hatch critique, sublimated into a criticism of aesthetics rather than a direct engagement with the content of the work, I also noted another reaction from white men, a desire to get close to me, to talk to me, an attraction to the source of the image, the transgression into taboo, perhaps a kind of seduction. In my personal life, the work also caused upheaval. Like many immigrant families, mine is close-knit, which can be a source of support, but also a perpetuation of trauma. I want to be careful here because these stories are not mine to tell, but the simple version is that the overt sexuality of my work, and I think the queerness in particular, really triggered my extended family, many of whom are survivors of sexual violence. One aunt emailed the family group saying that I needed to grow up and that my grandparents had been ashamed when I was born because I was born out of wedlock. While I was able to recognize these things on an intellectual level as not having anything to do with me, as products of other people's trauma, on an emotional level, they still hurt. It hurt to feel like my family could not understand me, could not even take a moment to ask me about the work before condemning me. But what hurt the most was the idea that my grandmother was ashamed of me, that she believed me to be fundamentally wrong, which aligned with the things she said to me and the way she treated me as a child. And so that in particular stuck with me for a long time. Even in writing the script for this podcast, a lot of emotions come up around this work. I can see now that even as it was a departure for me aesthetically and conceptually, it was also deeply connected to my practice, both before and after. I can't help but note that this work has had the most legs. It was the most widely disseminated and appeared in multiple publications. With Anna Storti's article that came out last month, I was again drawn back into this work and inspired to finally make tote bags with the goddesses' images on them for the Revolution Dressed shop. I feel proud of this work, proud of its energy, proud of the way it continues to be relevant to people. In this reflection, an old thought pattern arose, a critical voice always looking to question my creative choices. I started to wonder, have I been censoring myself? The How to Be a Monster work and the work that came after it, bedtime stories of white supremacy with Melanin, New Global Matriarchy with Stephanie Graham and others, my video knife woman, my exorcism performance at the mortuary. It seems to embody Clarissa Pinkola Estese's call to turn anger into fuel. And I started to worry that I had lost touch with some of that fuel, that I wasn't harnessing the fire. I was trying to hide it away again. It was almost like I was using my past self to harm my present self, which is an impressive mental contortion. I was trying to articulate this to my husband, Sean, to talk about what was bothering me when something clicked, a new thought pattern that had never been in my life before. I suddenly thought, if this was my son, all grown up, saying this about himself to me, what would my reaction be? How can I look at my life the way a loving parent would? And I started crying because I was able to look at everything, every choice, every challenge, every piece of art with complete love and acceptance, with unconditional support. For a moment, I could look at my life the way I look at my son when he learns a new word or slides down the slide or curls up in my arms to watch Sesame Street, and it was beautiful. It made me hope that now that my grandmother has passed on, can see life from the other side of the veil, as Perdita Finn says, that this is how she sees my life as well. And there's healing in that too. The moment I experienced was quite fleeting, and I find myself struggling to reconnect to that feeling. The beauty is tinged with a sense of loss, knowing that I did not have figures in my life growing up to give me what I am able to give to my son, what I'm trying to give to myself. In my journey of healing, I discovered clinical names for the things I experienced, but I always wondered, how did I escape the cycles that trapped my ancestors? How did I avoid some of the worst outcomes that clinical terms predict? I have memories of encountering incredible darkness and feeling so profoundly alone, but I think there was a voice there too that told me that I will survive, that I will heal, a compassionate voice. Perhaps it was my ancestors holding me. Perhaps it was my future self reaching back with everything that I know. What I do know for sure is that creativity, for me, art and writing, was the lifeline that kept me tethered to survival through all of this, a way to feel connected to a deep source that transcended this particular body, this particular life. Lately, I'm starting to think about joy as praxis. Joy is the thing that oppressive systems do not want you to experience, because joy leads to hope, and hope leads to possibilities, leads to dreaming of different realities, different futures. I'm starting to think that to find moments to be truly joyful in all this darkness is a revolutionary act. So that is my parting wish to you, dear listener, that you make joy your revolutionary praxis.